All right, it's very, very late at night. Everybody else is asleep. Hopefully it will stay that way and I won't get interrupted. And this video will be a synthesis of way more than an hour's worth of video reflections on the most current, at time of recording, episode of our Star Trek Adventures campaign, First Response. And its intent is to condense all of that down into a manageable video that will be tolerable for people to watch and not have to sift through looking for something of value. Okay, I'm going to try and keep it as organized as possible in sections. So I want to begin with system. I have seen definite signs of growth in understanding the system. Each player has brought a different methodology to that. Some in line with my own personal way of doing things, and some quite different. But the net result is that questions that people are asking have shifted from how to confirmation. Do I do it this way, or do I do it this way this time? So I find that very good. And the actual processing of everything is getting faster. So with that benchmark reached with system, it's now time to push toward expanding our ability in a different area. So what do I mean by that? It's time to start connecting our explicit system talk with explicit roleplay, so that these things can be united before what is currently happening and currently on display in the pilot and in Questions of Duty, Episode 1. Right? The way that we talk there is very much system forward. It's very much talk about roleplay rather than being able to, personally and individually connect with the roleplay. There's a barrier in language, and there's a barrier in approach, really, to that next step. And so before what we're doing now becomes habit, it's time to keep pushing. So we'll keep the tension, the learning tension on, but we're stepping away now, or I'll be moving away from an explicit focus on this is what the rule is, this is where you can find it, right? It's similar to this rule, leaving that behind and moving toward, unifying that with how we normally speak about what it is that we want to do. So in a sense, we took a step back from what people already know about role-playing games so that we could ground ourselves, or give the players every opportunity to ground themselves in the system, so that they could see and feel what's underpinning the Star Trek-ness of this game. And now we're taking a step back to zero to synthesize that together. We've got new rules, we've got role-playing habits and behaviors, and it's time for those two things to connect. Moving forward will be the point where we get beyond that point. And that's pretty cool. So that's pretty much all I have to say about system. Star Trek Adventures is actually a very fast system. It doesn't read that way, and you'll definitely note that in our play here, it's not all that fast. And of course, the reason for that is that there's a lot of talking about talking, and then there are, there's lots of tangents and efforts to engage on the personal level, which, are woven all the way throughout play. And there is a lot of hypothetical discussion, like, well, what could I do? What should I do? What would you like me to do? And all of those things are not something I want in my Star Trek Adventures play. In my experience, both in this campaign and in previous efforts, that leads to such a slowdown that things drag, and things always stay in that out of character zone where we're talking about the game, where we're proposing suggestions, and we're not really connecting, not really engaging on a personal level with it. And that's definitely of extreme importance to me. So as the sessions have moved forward, you've definitely seen me exert more and more and more insistence on, okay, not discussing things about making decisions, about using the resources as the character, to support decisions that the character would make. And as we go forward, that's only going to increase. So then we'll be just playing. Once we get there, we'll just be playing. So that's pretty cool. So I'm pretty happy, all things considered, with the speed with which the fundamentals were picked up, the preparation that went into things beforehand. This is carried through into the second session, or the second episode. Areas of concern that I have is the wiki is there for everybody to use, and I'm not sure that resource is being utilized fully. People can contribute to it. People can reference it. Can be active during play and this sort of stuff, so that we understand what's on the ship. We understand where things are in the ship, and this can inform interpersonal dialogue. It can inform imagination. We know where our crew quarters are. We know where the mess hall is. We know where the forward photon torpedo bays are, and how where would we have to travel to go from one phaser crew, like the port phaser crew, and we wanted to go to the rearward photon torpedo crew. What kind of journey is that? Just, it may never come up in play, but I find it's helpful for grounding the character in their environment. How big is the Avicenna, and what is next to each other? This sort of stuff. Who's on the Avicenna? What do we know about Anya Smith and Mbuto and Booba, and what does it mean to be an ensign? What does it mean to be an enlisted crew person? What is my role on the ship? These are questions that have come up, and they've come up in play, and perhaps through the use of our offline resources through Teams, we can answer those questions better for people to make use of their free time with, and not have to have them come up in the very limited play time. These are minor concerns, but they're things I need to take note of, because as we're moving away from learning and toward adjustment to the next stage of embracing this rule set, it's a period of evaluation. All right, systems done. Part 2 is character. So one of the earliest notes that I made after the first session of the Questions of Duty episode was that I want to see more of Ensign Yang, and I want Ensign Yang to be representative of what a main character is like, and not an exceptionally competent supporting character, which is what he's struck me as so far. Now, a lot of that is a failure on my part to adequately bring situations to bear for Ensign Yang to demonstrate his abilities and to have fun engaging with. Sometimes we have had those moments in this episode in particular, but not nearly enough. So I want us to feel like Ensign Yang is a main character. So I really need to think about that more. There have been times, yes, when the player has shied away from opportunities to engage as Ensign Yang, but I think there are more opportunities that went undelivered rather than not acted upon. Korsakov is definitely in main character territory, is involved in things, and is we're learning about Korsakov's feelings, and we're learning bits and pieces of what ties Korsakov to our setting and to some of the other characters, and we are seeing that the character has a stable core, was different in the past and is in the process of normal life change. So this is all very, very interesting. This is a sort of characterization that I think this game is good at supporting. There are a lot of perils associated with being the security chief. And in this particular episode, we got to see lethal violence up close and personal, and Korsakov was very, very close to being wiped from existence from by disruptor fire. Spoilers. So that was pretty interesting. I'm not sure, based on Ron's vast experience with play, how interesting this type of violence is. Certainly in his own games, there is a strong level of lethality up front, and in the Circle of Hands, for example, you can very easily lose a character. There's almost an expectation that you will, and then there's a built-in mechanic that allows you to keep playing in that session, in that the Circle Knights survive as as a spectral force, as a wraith, until the end of that episode. So the loss of your character doesn't eject the player from the game, and the way character creation works, you're unlikely to be able to bring someone else in. So it answers these questions really neatly, but the character is gone, and so the next time you play, something has to be done, right? So in Star Trek Adventures, there are extremely lethal consequences to engaging in violence. It's quite easy to phaser or disruptor fire someone out of existence. That's not much of a challenge at all. And so the game provides opportunities for, demonstrating the character's skill and ability, their preparation, their luck, or whatever it is that makes sense to the player to grab onto, but they have the capacity to what's called avoid injury. So because of the sequence of mechanisms in play, and this is one of the reasons why I started some of the supporting videos in this playlist with the obtain information explainer video, is that the order of operations for the system don't necessarily match the order of events in the fiction. So we establish certain truths. This is the type of attack it was, right? It is capable of, disintegrating your character, right? The character is going to be disintegrated unless, right, there is some pre-existing condition that enabled them to avoid the attack in the first place, right? So they're not being struck by disruptor fire and then recovering magically or whatever, right? The deadly blow was, just a grazing one. It missed completely, but they came in contact with, molten deck and were thereby injured that way, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of, room for creativity, but there are still hard limits to the number of times that you can actually use the system mechanism of avoid injury. So Korsakov was quite seriously injured, and I would have liked to have been able to get into what that all means in the episode, but we were totally out of time, and so it'll be a part of a subsequent episode. So I don't know how satisfying the ability to avoid injury is for Ron right now, or how it struck him in the moment, because we couldn't really connect with those mechanisms, but hopefully it doesn't feel too much like something he's spoken out against recently, which is, adjusting the outcomes for safety or to make things easier or whatever. I don't really see this mechanism as that. I see this as another way to bring character to the fore, much like television focuses on the characters and sets us up to believe certain things, and then reveals, what's actually happening in this episode. I see this mechanism as supporting that. And so hopefully. The third character, Tillich, unfortunately we lost as a played character, and so has become an NPC. And so I'm going to talk about that more in a different video. I'm going to talk about Tillich and my plans for this NPC later. Just here, I just want to say that I'm looking forward to playing with Tillich's player again soon. Very soon. So, that's character. Next, the fiction. I was pretty satisfied all the way along with this particular situation. I was very pleased as I thought more and more about the situation, with how many different vectors and approaches there were available to different crews. Like, this definitely seems like a situation that I would want to use again if I were to play Star Trek Adventures in the future. There, you might find a crew that is very direct and is looking for action, and you might find a very cerebral crew that's investigating everything, and you might find a very diplomatic crew, or you might find some push and pull mix of these different methodologies. And I think that this situation, this search and rescue in the Elas and Troyes, the Helena system, is a really ripe one to allow for a lot of different instances of player ingenuity. So I was really happy with what could have been and what still can be, and that kind of stuff. This group approached the situation, again, very directly, very focused on the mission. And what I noticed about the fiction was that it pretty much stayed on that level of moving through, trying to find the ship. And I found that to be interesting. But the story, looking back on it, the story basically is the Avicenna is diverted because it's the nearest appropriate ship, and it arrives to become a part of a search and rescue mission for a dignitary for Elas. They make contact with the Troyans, and the Troyans seem to be far more active in space. They seem to be far more active with interplanetary or interstellar visitors. And there are diplomatic troubles which get smoothed over, and the Avicenna coordinates a highly effective search grid which reveals no ship. And so they have to apply their logic and their advanced sensors and computing power to figure out, well, if we didn't find it with this search grid, where are the only places that they can hide? And they narrowed it down to a few. And it turns out that one of those places had been a place of interest earlier on in the episode, but it had been put on the back burner. So they go to investigate, they find some wreckage, and they find a trail. In following the trail, a lot of damage is done to the ship, blowing out the ship's sensors, causing a long delay. And because it was the sensors that were knocked out, they were not really sure at the time what it was that caused this effect. Turns out this was, meddling by the villains of the piece. So once they get back in motion again, they're very quickly following down this trail, and they're gathering information. They're figuring out this is an Orion ship, and it's using sensor baffling technology, not unlike a cloak. And they come across an Elasian ship and a Troyan ship, and it looks like hostilities are about to happen. The Elasians are going to fire on the Troyans. So the crew of the Avicenna is in a position or they're actually under a directive to prevent hostilities from breaking out. So they interpose themselves between the two ships, and a little bit of cowboy diplomacy goes on. And this marks the transition point from Tillich's original player to me running him as an NPC. So he moves from the thoughtful and nuanced character he was to being a lot more like a caricature, and that's unfortunate because Tillich was a character I've really liked. So Tillich is a little more daring than you'd expect from a Vulcan. So Captain Tillich has the commanders of the two vessels, surprisingly beamed on board the Avicenna for a sit down and talk and let's get to the bottom of this. Why are you guys? Why have you come to this pass? And while that discussion is happening, Lieutenant Korsakov takes the con and is put into a combat situation as the Orions, because that is what we've suddenly realized that is behind all of this. They attack, and they attack the local vessels and not the Avicenna to begin with. And they've revealed that they have phasers and they have disruptors, and this is very interesting. So very quickly, the crew's piecing it together that the long suspected Klingon involvement in this entire thing is fantasy. It's someone who wants us to think it's the Klingons, but whatever it is, they're definitely trying to cause unrest in this system. And if it's the Orions, then therefore it's war profiteering. This all makes sense, all falls into place. And perhaps the surprising part of it all is that the Orions are willing to fight to the death. And so with a little bit more information, they learn that, the USS Enterprise encountered such a vessel in the past, and that, it scuttled itself, and it's perhaps not unreasonable to suspect this crew to do the same. So they worked very hard to prevent that and were quite successful. Meanwhile, of course, it turns out that the people beamed on board, some of them were actually Orions in surgical disguise, and diplomacy broke down and became a running gun battle inside the ship, which led to the near-fatal wounding of Lieutenant Korsakov. We're still not really sure what the outcome of his injuries is going to be. And, the death of all the Orions responsible, some by, suicide mechanism. How do things end up? Well, they end up with no war, with an understanding that they're being manipulated from outside, but with a hint that there is significant unrest in this system, and there are those, such as the Klingons, who are willing to prey on it. So that's, in a capsule view, the fiction, which wouldn't necessarily appear that way to some of the individual characters involved, right? Ensign Yang is not present in all scenes. Captain Tillich is not present in all scenes. Lieutenant Korsakov is not present in all scenes. They all have different exposure to information and different exposure and different exposure to their departments and their view of the world, and so we wind up with a very, very open-ended perspective on what did we accomplish, what did we do. The vessel, of course, that they were searching for was lost, and they recognized before the end that the Orions were operating with assistance from another ship, which got away. So what does all this mean? It's hard to say. This is not really the duty of the Avicenna or its crew to uncover, but their name, now forever after, will be attached to this event in history. So, in terms of, let's move on to the next part, performance. In terms of my own performance in bringing all this about, I want to see myself make stronger scenes. And by stronger scenes, I mean things that have, that these players can grab onto as moments that matter, that connect to their character and connect to the situation strongly enough that they can feel confident that their way is clear, that they know what they want to do with this character in this time, in this place, as that character. So I'm going to have to step up my game there. I also want them to start more clearly, right, with a greater clarity of description, and I want them to finish when they're finished. I don't want them to drag on and have people trying to extend them. I want them to end, so that we can move on to more characters doing more things that make sense in order, rather than, this kind of formless play. So recognizing that the scenes are a technique, and I need to get better at them, I'm hoping the players can work with me to help bring that about. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted more Ensign Yang. I didn't quite get there, but I hope it was an improvement, and I'm happy with Korsakov getting to Korsakov. So we'll see what goes from there. So like I said, I guess the last stage of this is that now I'm in an evaluation mode. I'm looking at how people are talking to each other, what language is actually being used. I'm looking at what we wanted from the original series and what we didn't want from the original series, and what we wanted from play of Star Trek Adventures and what we didn't want from our play of Star Trek Adventures, and seeing how well we're meeting those goals. And if there are areas where we're not meeting them, then that will be something to take up directly with my fellow members of the group, such as in our Teams resource or whatnot. So for the coming episode, there will be the promotion and reputation system to look at. And if this is the first one of these that you watched, I'm using the new system from the revised rules, which first appear in the Klingon core book. So there is a free PDF which talks about the Starfleet version of this, and it's, in my opinion, very tightly tuned to the next generation perspective, as is almost all of the imagery and a lot of the examples and art in the original Star Trek Adventures core book. So the specific elements that the players are going to be asked about their characters, are in the process of being changed to match the specific mission of the Avicenna, not to match the player's play style or the player's predilections or views on Starfleet or the Federation or whatever. It's being tweaked because what's presented for the Klingons and what's presented for Starfleet is a generic do this kind of procedure, and it's good. So if you're playing one of the typical campaigns, like Going Boldly, then you're going to find it's a really useful tool. But there's a difference between what questions we're asking the Klingons about their successes and failures and what questions we're asking Starfleet about their successes and failures, which is guidance to us that if the mission profile, if the core of the campaign is going in a different direction, then those questions need to be adjusted. So we're in the process of adjusting those questions so that they specifically matter to the aid and relief role of the ship. So we have injury mechanics ahead of us, and we have reputation ahead of us, and I'm looking forward to both. I had hoped to do them offline or on a different day, but there just aren't enough days in the week. Anyway, I'm going to end this reflection here. I hope that people are getting something out of Star Trek Adventures First Response. I know that with the approach to making the mechanisms of play as explicit as possible, and the willingness to slow the game down to talk about why things are being done and how things are being done, how things could be done, it's not exactly viewer-friendly, but I hope it has value when you settle down to learn the game yourself, and you can see what what we found easy and what we found difficult, and the common pitfalls that groups wind up in, such as let's create another advantage, and should I or should I not spend this momentum, this kind of stuff. So you can see it in action and say, this is why there's advice not to do that. Okay, and hopefully as the campaign progresses, you'll also see us finding solutions to those things that work for all of us in the group, because it is a group, and each member contributes. Each member is important. So, okay. I have lots of stuff I want to say about the next episode, but it'll have to wait. Take care.